tackle them. Steve.
Thanks, Shane. Unique among the panelists here, I run a trade association of businesses, and our mission is simple. We want to make the internet safe for free enterprise and free expression. But lately, the last few years, that's become mission impossible, both here and abroad. And this is the 15th year of State of the Net, and I have to ask myself, how did we come to this? Because 15 years ago, we had a huge disruption as the internet enabled the disruption of control exercised by governments and the control exercised by large incumbent businesses. Think about the taxi industry, the hotel industry, retailers, and even newspapers and big media. That disruption 15 years ago led to this whole theme that talked about free flow of information. But 15 years later, I would have to say to you that governments and big businesses have regained their footing and are reasserting control. That is resulting in a balance of power that hasn't been present lately. The question is, how far will that balance swing? Will the pendulum swing way past neutral into a situation where we get multilateralism and some of the ills that Laura and the others have discussed? I think what it shows is that with regard to the internet, we fit the old rule that success doesn't get you friends, it just gets you a better class of enemies.
Thanks.
So the question that Shane put to us was discussion of a global order for the internet. Now, I have to suggest to you that is another mission impossible. There might be aspirations for global values, but they are going to get crushed by sovereignty concerns and realpolitik. We've mentioned the Paris call, and I was there in Paris when this happened. Let me quote to you the part of the Paris call that all of us agreed with is that the internet has become central to almost every aspect of human existence, check, and the threat, the main threat, is cyber attacks by state and non-state actors, which threaten individuals in the free flow of commerce and information. Who wouldn't sign up to that kind of norms? Well, part of it is because President Macron followed the Paris call with a 45-minute speech at the Internet Governance Forum at 5 o'clock Monday that afternoon, where he interpreted it somewhat differently, although this is an English translation. He said, we must defend against the excesses of the internet. So the excesses of the internet, that's music to the ears of Russia and China and any regime. He said platforms are directing content to users that brings them dangerous ideas. Dangerous ideas. He said we could allow all voices to express online, but in the name of these universal values, we should not, because too much liberty will endanger universal values. This is Macron. In the final excerpt, he said, I heard murmurs in the room, because he's speaking extemporaneously, when I say that we need to regulate the internet in order to keep it free. He said, but listen, not all governments are equal. Some liberal democracies are just better. So with a speech teed up like that, there's no wonder when you turned to Davos last week, we heard Germany say that, well, when it comes to geopolitical order, no, Germany has their own way of interpreting privacy through GDPR, and they have their own methods of imposing obligations on platforms for hate speech. We heard China say that they would use their own rules when it comes to free expression. And we know that businesses have become adept at pursuing mercantilist policies to advantage themselves with national government policies. But I don't want to be entirely negative, because I want to fondly recall the light touch regulatory environment that enabled the internet innovation in communications, peer-to-peer commerce and sharing of ideas, and also the access to knowledge, how the internet has enabled anyone with a browser to get access to so much of the world's store of knowledge. How did we get there? Think back 15, 20 years. A number of you in the room were there at the creation, but the Clinton administration in '98 said, let's commercialize and internationalize the governance of the internet. And they started with ICANN. We had Section 230, which was a piece of the Communications Decency Act that said that platforms are not strictly liable for the content and commerce of people that use the platform. And that is what gave birth to the peer-to-peer revolution. We also had privacy laws that were based on consumer harms, not just feeling creepy, but consumer harms. Two more. We have a consumer welfare standard when it comes to the application of antitrust laws. We look to see whether bigness and behavior on a large company is hurting consumers, not whether it hurts competitors. And finally, we have a physical presence standard, or at least we used to, when it came to the taxation of cross-border activity. I guess that went away in June of last year when the Supreme Court threw out the Quill case. And that's been followed by an advent of new laws which reach across borders to impose taxation. So as we move away from that original state, that original environment that created the internet, if we move away from that in the US and in the rest of the world, we are going to see an increase in barriers to entry and a decrease in innovation. And only the largest internet firms, who are among my members, are going to be able to afford the costs and complexities of compliance. And even so, they will make mistakes frequently. And those mistakes will generate calls for even greater regulation and even greater barriers to entry. The question I would have is, will the citizens, those of us in this room and in different countries, are we just going to sit still and let them boil the frog of internet innovation? Or do we feel the burn, each in our own way, and seek a return to a freer time? That's a question that will be answered within each country, within each culture. Because as I said earlier, there won't be a geopolitical order. That's a myth. So nor will there be a geopolitical consistency at trying to return to the free internet we gave birth to here 15 or 20 years ago. Thank you.
We'll put a lot on our plate. He'd like to respond to that?
Peter, I'd love to engage on that, because one of the strangest parts of Europe's interpretation of its rights is this thing called the right to be forgotten, because it clashes. It creates this dignity and privacy right, but it says that Europeans don't actually have a right to know about material information that has happened and been published, but they don't want search engines to be able to retrieve it. In 5 years, the right to be forgotten has resulted in 1 million links being stripped out of search engines so that those search engines couldn't access the underlying information that had already been published. Fully 20% of those 1 million links that had to be stripped away were stripped from news sources, where a news source might have had a very critical article of an athlete or actor's performance, or just last week, news and websites that reported on certain doctors who'd had their licenses revoked. And the lawyer for those doctors was successful on appeal at getting the right to be forgotten to force the search engines, Google and others, to strip that away. So if I'm searching for information on that doctor, I don't know that she's had her license revoked, and she subsequently had it partially restored. I mean, I'd like to know both pieces of information, but under right to be forgotten, what Europe has done is teed up one right against another and relying on individual court decisions to figure out how to balance the rights. But Peter, it is all about balancing rights. The rights for me to freely express, the rights for me to innovate and create something, all of those typically clash. And I don't think it's even honest to suggest that you've got it all figured out and that Europe's rights are fundamental, universal, and ought to be applied everywhere.
Laura, do you want to, since he was talking about the broken links, can you kind of talk about what that happens?
Yeah, Prime Minister Abe talks about data governance. And remember, governments retain the ability to govern what their citizens see, what they do, and what they say. Governments can regulate that. They can put people in jail, whether it happened over the internet, over the telephone, or the television. So none of that has changed, but data governance is a very convenient way for nations to justify economically beneficial activities that they want to pursue. I'll give you just 2 examples where you can follow the money. One is data localization, and a number of other panelists have mentioned it as well. In the name of data governance and protecting my citizens' privacy, I'll require that their data can't be kept in servers in California. They've got to be kept here, domestically, in Indonesia, in Brazil, in China, in Russia. That data localization is an economic nationalism policy, since it brings that data and the expense of maintaining it to that nation's economic development. Another is this notion that the data and images that are shown to European eyes is an activity that the Europes want to be able to tax. The digital services tax is a way of governing the data that crosses the Atlantic and shows up on the screens and cell phones of Europeans. And if that is subject to a 4% tax, as Spain, Italy, France are trying to accomplish right now, that is what happens when you allow the governance of data across borders in a way that countries can use it for whatever purpose they want. And it often involves their own economy and their own treasury.
Laura?
Adam, thanks for the great work you do on permissionless innovation, and I would love to return to those days but they are gone. I think it's now necessary to ask permission rather than beg forgiveness when it comes to innovation. And that gives rise to the best answer to your question is that we are already well past multi-stakeholder and multilateral, and we're in an atmosphere of battling bilaterals. France, wanting to enforce its right to be forgotten, is seeking a court ruling to force those search engines based here in the U.S. to not even return an answer that could be seen by those French eyes if somebody wants to check out whether a doctor is licensed. GDPR is exporting the European concept and financial penalties for privacy violations across borders, since it applies no matter where in the world. If you're affecting the data of a European resident who may not even be in Europe at the time, you're susceptible. So inevitably, the U.S. and France and Europe are going to have to work out bilateral arrangements, because we can't have this escalating battle where we block their content and they block ours. That doesn't serve anyone's interests. So I'm afraid we are already past the best of both worlds and moving toward an area where saner heads are going to have to prevail. We work out things like safe harbors, reciprocity in bilateral arrangements, and perhaps a limited scope of multilateral.
Steve?
I think it's very promising to look at the convenience, transparency, and verifiability of votes that are recorded in a way that is easy to do and easy to verify. So a blockchain-based database, for instance, offers transparency, but that's going to clash with my right to privacy with respect to how I cast a ballot. So you've got to reconcile that transparency with preserving the anonymity of those who voted. And when you add anonymity, you decrease the ability to verify that exactly the right eligible people in a given precinct actually voted. When it comes to the Internet's participation in elections, the topic du jour is not how do I vote, but how are voters being influenced by misinformation, right, and campaigns where state actors, as well as private actors, are using the Internet to spread disinformation and divide people. And that seems to me to be the major concern. It's one which brought a lot of politicization to an otherwise neutral platform. Shane was a mentor of mine years ago, and what she rued the most was an idea that we would start to politicize the governance of the Internet through ICANN or IANA. Well, right now we are politicizing peer-to-peer platforms. We politicize what speech is allowed on Facebook, and we politicize the president's not happy with mostly negative news coming back in a search and wants to somehow compel or punish the search engines if they don't put his good news higher than the bad news. You know, even a country with a First Amendment knows that a government can exert power in a lot of other ways that aren't prohibited by the First Amendment. So I think the elections are more at risk with areas that we can't solve with just e-voting.
And I have to tell you, we're at time.